Jesus told his disciples, "In this world you will have tribulation." You find that in John 16:33. Tribulation came from at least two areas in the early church: persecution and false teaching. These two pressures pushed the church to make subtle leadership changes to meet these pressures. In this lecture, I want to present a look at both early persecution as well as several growing challenges from false doctrine. Let's take persecution first. When Christians today think of persecution in the early church, they immediately think of Christians huddled together in the Roman circus, awaiting death from lions or other wild animals or gladiators or others who were charged with putting them to death. There's a story told about a young woman named Blandina. She was a 13-year-old servant girl who found herself arrested with her mistress. Both women stood firmly for their faith in spite of the pressure placed upon them. Roman torturers thought young Blandina would break, but soldiers wore themselves out trying to wear her down. She stood firm for her faith. Blandina and others eventually went to the amphitheater. Soldiers placed Blandina in a net where a bull repeatedly gored her to death. Many Christians died for their faith, but the worst persecutions did not occur until the 3rd century. Christians today often have many misunderstandings about the persecution these early Christians faced. Let me mention several. It is often thought that Romans tried to eradicate Christians, but that's not true. Roman persecution was never designed to eradicate Christianity. While warfare in those days was violent and destructive, Roman legions never engaged in what we call today ethnic cleansing. Romans did consider Christianity a pernicious superstition, but they never considered it something so serious that they had to completely annihilate every Christian they found. The second misunderstanding is the fact that many Christians believe that when persecution came, it was always empire-wide. This is not true either. In reality, Roman persecution was sporadic and local. Granted, Rome considered Christianity a religio illicita, in other words, an illegal religion, and punishment for refusing to renounce Christian faith did lead to death, but there was never a widespread effort to wipe it out. In addition, geographic location and the intensity of Roman officials often determined persecution's intensity. There were a lot more Christians in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. After all, that's where the church started, and that's where it grew first. And so with more Christians in the population, there would be more who would be identified, and there would be more who would be oppressed. But then, too, there were always bureaucrats, Roman officials, who wanted to gain favor with the emperor, and they often ramped up oppression just to see if they could curry favor. Many people today think that persecution was always intense, but that's not true either. Roman persecution differed during the early part of the church's beginnings or toward the 3rd or 4th century. In the early part of the church's history, they were living under what was known as the Principate. The Principate existed from 31 BC to AD 284, and during this time, the emperor was simply known as the Princeps, the first among equals, and the Senate controlled them. Emperors focused their attention on global issues or empire-wide issues and spent little time worrying about Christians. In addition, Christians rarely gave any kind of reason for persecution. Romans knew that Christians refused to take up arms or to rebel against Rome. They were a peace-loving people and known to be such. But this changed later as we near the time of Constantine. During that time also, which is now known as the Dominate, the period from AD 284 to 476, the emperors no longer answered to the Senate. They paid attention to the superstitions. They were the rulers. They were the ones who had responsibility for the welfare of the empire. And they believed some of these superstitions, like Christianity, caused division. Oppression intensified as a result. And emperors, concerned for the state's welfare, did all they could to bring Christians to heel. But why did they persecute Christians? Why was there so much animosity toward Christianity? Let me just give you several reasons. For a while, Romans identified Christianity as simply another Jewish sect. They thought it was just another sect like the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Herodians or the Zealots or what have you. But when the break came, when Jews no longer considered Christians a part of their own religion, and they pushed Christians away, the Romans began to take notice. They considered Christianity a new superstition, and it became suspect. They heard rumors about Christians, and Romans feared the new religion might destabilize the empire. So here are 5 reasons. First, Romans considered Christians unpatriotic. The Christians refused to participate in the regular offerings to the city gods and goddesses. Furthermore, they rejected demonstrations of honor to the emperor. For Romans, offering incense to Caesar, along with the profession Caesar is Lord, meant little more than today's Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. It was simply a symbol of citizenship. It was simply a statement that I'm a citizen of Rome and I recognize Rome's power and I'm loyal to the country, to the nation, or the empire of Rome. But Christians couldn't do that because they could never acknowledge anyone as Lord but Jesus. Secondly, Romans considered Christians perpetrators of outrageous crimes or individuals who practiced wickedness or evil deeds. You see, Romans thought Christians committed incest and cannibalism. These were things Romans wouldn't consider. They wouldn't do that. Romans heard rumors that infants born of incestuous relationships were offered as living sacrifices and then consumed. Hearing Christians refer to themselves as brother or sister also contributed to the belief that these people were grossly immoral. Furthermore, they heard Christians talk about eating and drinking the body and blood of the Lord. And such statements led to the belief that Christians offered infants, often born as the result of incest as sacrifices, and then these sacrifices were eaten as part of their religious rituals. Thirdly, Romans recognized that Christians often renounced family and friends. As I noted in the last lecture, Roman religion centered on family honor and devotion. Accepting the new faith often meant severing family ties due to family and earned family disfavor. You can understand this in the light of what Jesus said, that if you love father or mother more than me, you're not worthy of me. And so sometimes it became essential in the minds of the Christians to pull away from their families because the families expected them to continue the worship to the family gods or to continue to honor their ancestors in ways that almost seemed religious to the Christians. And so the Christians pulled away. Or if they didn't pull away, their family members disavowed them and drove them away. And to the Roman mind, this would have been reprehensible. This would have been something that couldn't have been accomplished or done with any kind of favor. Furthermore, Romans thought that Christianity was new. While Romans were always willing to accept gods worshipped elsewhere, new cults or new religions were suspect. While Christianity remained connected to Judaism in the mind of the Romans, there was no problem. But the moment the two faiths separated, Rome took another look and concluded these strange followers of a crucified troublemaker were atheists or worse. Then, too, Romans saw Christians as intolerant and exclusive. As I mentioned in the last lecture, Romans were henotheistic. They accepted everyone's gods as long as they could be understood. They were pluralistic. They saw no difficulty in recognizing the multiplicity of gods and goddesses in the empire. They simply recognized them and added them to the pantheon. But Christians, like Jews, were exclusive. The early church insisted there was no God but Jehovah, and there was no hope of salvation except through Jesus. Christians had no coexist bumper stickers on their chariots. As the first century progressed, Roman attitudes toward Christians hardened, and they attacked Christians as they had never attacked Jews. Christians became followers of an illegal religion and were often scapegoated. Some of the first persecutions are interesting. The first persecution probably occurred in AD 49 when the Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome. Underlying Claudius's decision was a conflict that occurred within Judaism in the city of Rome over someone called Chrestus. Although it's debated, the conflict probably arose because Jews were arguing within their own synagogues over whether Jesus was their Messiah. The struggle may have reached such a pitch that Claudius simply ended it by expelling the Jews. Acts 18, verses 2 and 3, tells us Christians left Rome at the same time. Now, I realize this isn't much of a persecution, but it did draw attention to the separation of Christianity from Judaism. The first real persecution came during the reign of Nero. Nero enjoyed a reputation for wild living and excess. During the first few years of imperial rule, he gained a reputation for generosity and sharing power with the Senate. He gathered around himself some qualified advisors, particularly Seneca and Burrus, two well-known senators, and also he included in his advisors Agrippina, his mother, who tried to dominate him. Seneca, one of his counselors, advised him to abandon his mother. Within a short time, there was a great deal of political intrigue within the imperial palace, and that led to a number of murders, including Agrippina. After her death, Nero turned to more aesthetic pursuits, such as singing and playing the lyre. He became a participant in the theater and himself was participated in a number of immoral activities. In the morning of June 19th, AD 64, a blaze broke out in the shops around the Circus Maximus, and that fire quickly spread throughout the city. Over the next 9 days, 3 of Rome's 14 districts were destroyed, and an additional 7 were severely damaged. Classical sources place Nero on the roof of his palace during the fire, dressed in the garb of an actor and singing from the Greek epic, The Sack of Ilium. Rumors quickly circulated that the emperor started the fire to clear land for an expanded palace complex on Palatine Hill. These rumors were probably true, as Rome consisted largely of shacks at that time, and poorly constructed wood homes were throughout the city. Nero had in mind the building of a beautiful city which would honor not only himself but the gods of Rome. When the populace blamed him for the fire, he scapegoated Christians, blaming them for the conflagration. After all, these suspicious people constantly spoke of the world ending in fire. He immediately instituted persecution against the Christians in order to escape the rancor of his own people. So intense was his persecution, it quickly drew pity from the populace. Tacitus, a Roman historian of the time and no lover of Christians, tells about Nero's persecution in some of his writings. He writes, "Arrest was first made of those who confessed, to being a Christian, of course. Then an immense multitude was convicted, not so much on the charge of arson as because of hatred of the human race. Besides being put to death, they were made to serve as objects of amusement. They were clad in the hides of beasts and torn to death by dogs. Others were crucified, others set on fire to serve to illuminate the night when daylight failed. Nero had thrown open his grounds for the display, and was putting on a show in the circus where he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or drove about in his chariot. All this gave rise to a feeling of pity, even towards men whose guilt merited the most exemplary punishment, for it was felt that they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to gratify the cruelty of an individual." And that ends Tacitus' testimony. Nero's persecution was intense, but it was localized. Nero made little effort to extend the persecution beyond Rome. During this persecution, Paul was beheaded, which befits the execution of a Roman citizen. Peter was crucified, as was normal for a citizen of the provinces. Tradition tells us Peter died nailed upside down to a cross outside of the city of Rome on the Appian Way. There were other minor persecutions along the way, but Domitian came to the imperial throne in September of AD 81 after the death of Titus. Domitian proved to be an able administrator in his early reign and gained popularity among the people. He raised wages for soldiers, built a new temple to Jupiter, a new stadium, and a new palace. Later he became paranoid, however. His fear of assassination and his greed made him cruel. He demanded recognition as Dominus et Deus, in other words, Master and God. He renamed 2 months with his name. Determined to preserve the integrity of the gods and the stability of the Roman state, he instituted persecution against Christians on the charge of atheism. Although the worst persecution was limited to Rome, there were cities devoted to the emperor whose leaders also instigated persecution, and those cities were found throughout the empire. During Domitian's persecution, Rome exiled the Apostle John to Patmos. Persecution spread throughout Asia Minor, as Jesus' letters to the 7 churches in Revelation attest. Scholars think John's description of Rome found in Revelation 17:5 described the intensity of Domitian's attack on the church. John described Rome as Babylon the Great, mother of harlots, drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. That's found in Revelation 17, verse 5. Rome's policies regarding Christians eased in the early 2nd century, but Christianity remained an illegal religion. Pliny the Younger helps us understand Rome's policies in the early 2nd century. Pliny sends a letter to the Emperor Trajan, and in that letter he requested instructions on how to deal with Christians. Trajan instructs Pliny in a reply letter to apply the same policies Rome uses to deal with other religions which the Romans considered superstitions. He tells Pliny to leave them alone. Don't seek them out unless a bona fide accusation is heard. And even then, if there's an accusation, he shouldn't act upon it unless there are at least 2 accusers. If there are 2 accusers, they put the individual on trial and order the Christians to offer a sacrifice to the gods. And if they do, let them go. If they refuse or admit to being Christian, then put them to death. There's one other little interesting tidbit about all of that, and that is the fact that Trajan advised Pliny that if there was an accusation made against an individual for being a Christian, and it turned out the individual was not a Christian, then the accuser was to face the same penalty that would face the potential Christian. Trajan's policies remained in place during the reign of Hadrian and during the reign of Antonius Pius. Emperors following Antonius Pius applied a bit more pressure to the Christians, but by and large persecution remained sporadic. Oddly, Christians considered emperors better leaders when persecution occurred. Why? Well, it's simple. The emperors who cared enough about the empire's stability to engage in persecution were better leaders. And those who cared only for themselves or for satisfying their own lusts for power and greed generally let things go. Roman persecution placed tremendous pressure on Christians. They responded in one of 2 ways. 1, martyrdom, or 2, accommodations. Christians who found it difficult to stand in the face of the threat of death offered required sacrifices to satisfy Roman officials. Letters to the 7 churches in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3 imply some willingly faced death, while others gave in to the pressure and denied Christ. External threats from Roman officials were not the only threats facing the early church, however. Threats arose from within the church itself. Paul warned about such pressures when he addressed the Ephesian elders in Acts 20. He warned those church leaders in Ephesus there would be those who would arise within the church seeking to draw Christians away into false teaching. You can see that in verses 29 and 30. In some cases, the false teachers merely started a trend within the church. In other cases, these false teachers held strange and really stupid ideas. Rarely did church leaders take harsh action against those who held weird ideas. When they did, it was usually because there was a stubborn resistance to the truth, or there was an organized counter-movement against the church. In such cases, strict church discipline followed, which sometimes led to expulsion or excommunication. Let's look at several of these early heretical movements. First is the Ebionites. Often considered the first Christians, Ebionites were a sect of Jewish Christians who appeared about AD 70 at the time Titus destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. In the past, Bible scholars confused Ebionites with Judaizers. With Judaizers in the New Testament. Ebionites believed Jesus was the Messiah, but was naturally born child of Joseph and Mary. The Ebionites believed Jesus kept God's laws so well, God adopted him as his son at his baptism, and later sent him to the cross as the perfect sacrifice for sin. In other words, then, if Jesus were simply the offspring of Joseph and Mary, he lived a nearly perfect life and did so well that he could become a perfect sacrifice for sin. And because of this belief, the Ebionites are known as adoptionists, those who believe that Jesus was simply adopted by God for his own purposes. And this belief reappears from time to time. Furthermore, Ebionites fastidiously kept the Jewish law and believed individuals must first become Jews before accepting Christ, much like the Judaizers. Ebionism lasted for several centuries, hidden away among the Jews of the diaspora. Another heresy of the time is that of Docetism. Docetism is the belief that Jesus would not have had a human body if he were really deity. The idea arose out of a philosophical view which said the created world is evil, or more likely, it could be a desire simply to elevate the divinity of Jesus. You will read about Docetism in the history books, but there is no specific docetic movement. Rather, it is an attitude. It's a mindset. It's a perspective. There were those in the church who held such a high view of Christ that they believed he simply could not be fully human. Philosophers, particularly those of the Platonic school, simply could not believe God could take on human flesh. Those who held this idea generally have a low view of creation and of humanity. Flesh or material things are messy and disgusting. And therefore, Jesus, if he were really deity, if he were the Son of God, could not have had a fleshly body. It only seemed that he did. Docetism did not last long, but vestiges of it can be seen in other trends even yet today. Perhaps one of the most serious threats to the early church was that of Gnosticism. Gnosticism proved to be one of the more disruptive trends within the church. It's commonly believed Gnosticism was a well-defined religion or movement. Bart Ehrman, who's a liberal scholar, identifies Gnosticism as another Christianity, simply another version of Christianity. But it's not a religion. It's not really separate from Christianity, as it has no single consistent set of beliefs and is better understood as an inclination or a set of impulses. What we know about Gnosticism comes from a discovery of 13 documents found in Upper Egypt in 1945. These books discuss a variety of Gnostic ideas and are well known for a number of Gnostic Gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Truth. Prior to this discovery, which is known as the Nag Hammadi Library, all historians had to go on were anti-Gnostic writings of Irenaeus and other early church fathers. Gnostics themselves were believers who held a set of views relating to the created world, salvation, and the life of the believer. Gnostics believed they had a certain enlightenment or spiritual knowledge that no one else possessed. Gnostic beliefs are really a smorgasbord as they draw from a lot of other philosophies and ideas. Gnostics had an aversion to Orthodox Christianity, and in response to the church's sound doctrine, Gnostics reacted with a view that shunned the material world. Gnostic beliefs represent a dualism between the material world and the spiritual world. Because of these ideas, they believed the world could not have been created by a benevolent God, but rather it was created by an evil deity. Gnostics had an alternative concept of salvation too. For them, salvation came about through some sort of self-denial, which led to enlightenment. There are several fundamental Gnostic beliefs, but they still don't consist of a basic system. Their ideas are as follows. The Gnostics believed that the world humans experience isn't really real. And this idea comes from Plato, the Greek philosophy. Now, if you saw the movie The Matrix, you get an idea of what the Gnostic perception of reality can be. Thus, there is no truth to be discovered in the world. They seek truth outside the world as we know it. Another belief that they held is simply that the world is something to be hated and despised. The real you, they thought, is not the material you of your body, but rather it is a spirit trapped in the physical. Gnostics believed that a piece of God somehow got trapped in human flesh. Salvation, then, is the release of the God Spirit. If you want a way to think about this, think of Yoda with Luke on Tatooine or in one of the other scenes in the Star Wars saga. He says, "Luminous beings we are, not this crude matter." But the Bible tells us that God created human beings, body and spirit. And yet there are some today who believe the real you isn't the physical body at all, but is somehow tied up with a spiritual reality. This is really an old Gnostic concept. And then thirdly, the Gnostics had an elitist knowledge which was required for salvation. Gnostics really didn't have an evangelistic impulse. Why? Because they're the elite. Only they had access to secret knowledge, and they don't really need to share it. This is something that only they have, and it's something that clues them in that they alone are the ones who are approved by God. But as you think about these things, always remember Genesis 1. At every step of the creation, God paused and looked, and he said, "It's good." And when he created Adam, a physical being, and breathed into him the breath of life, his response is varied. God says, "Now it's very good." And so material things really aren't all that evil. They aren't necessarily evil, but rather material things are evil if you choose to use them in a way that causes them to be evil or sinful. Another heresy that arose in the 2nd century is that of Marcionism. Marcion, the originator of this false teaching, was born in Sinope, a town on the northern shore of Asia Minor on the Black Sea. His father was a bishop in the Sinope church. Evidently, Marcion upset his father with some of his ideas, so he went to Rome about 130. The Roman church received him with open arms, and in appreciation, Marcion donated 200,000 sesterces to the church, which made him even more welcome. Not long after, however, the Roman church's elders began to realize Marcion held some strange ideas. And when they realized how serious they really were, they excommunicated him in AD 144. But the church leaders in Rome not only excommunicated Marcion, they returned every sesterces that he had given the church. Now, how many churches do you think would do that today? What were Marcion's strange ideas? Well, Marcion was anti-Semitic to the nth degree. He believed the New Testament church needed to be cleansed of any Jewish residue. For Marcion, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were two different beings. The Old Testament God was tyrannical and cruel. The God of the New Testament was loving and kind. Marcion saw this as a dramatic contrast with the Christian faith. Now, how often do you hear that today? The belief that some have that the God of the Old Testament was cruel and wicked and violent and simply was a God of vengeance. But the God of the New Testament, the God of Jesus, was loving and kind. This is a Marcionite idea. This is a Gnostic idea. Secondly, Marcion formed his own canon, his own list of approved scripture. To eliminate traces of Judaism, Marcion threw out most of the Bible. He accepted the Gospel of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters, which he edited to reflect his views. Then, too, Marcion held a different view of salvation. Salvation, according to Marcion, is not Jesus coming as a sacrifice to pay the penalty for sin. Rather, Jesus came to overthrow the Old Testament God. He tried to remove any idea of judgment. Marcion's ideas sometimes crop up, as I've indicated already, among those who are anti-Semitic, and often in liberal Christianity. There are those who insist the God of the Old Testament is a malevolent being standing ready to judge, while the God of the New Testament is loving and sweetly kind. Montanism, or the New Prophecy movement, appeared in Phrygia, located in the west central region of modern Turkey. It was an area known for ecstatic outbreaks, and so it was not unusual to hear of a variety of manifestations in the worship of the gods. Montanus and his two protégés, Prisca and Maximilla, believed they were the mouthpiece of the Holy Spirit. Montanus taught his followers to see God in the Old Testament, Jesus in the writings of the apostles, and to listen to the Holy Spirit. In addition, Montanus believed they had a prophecy from the Spirit which told them when Jesus would return. They set a date for Jesus' return and stated he would return to the town of Pepuza, a small community in Phrygia, and this prediction led to their downfall when it didn't come true. Montanism opposed the church's dependence on human leadership rather than direct leadership of the Holy Spirit. The reason for this opposition becomes clear when you understand the reaction of the church to external and internal pressure. Montanism also raised questions about perceived growing moral laxness in the church. Montanus promoted holy and disciplined living, challenging those who denied the faith under pressure or who followed Gnostic teachers, and charged them with being unfaithful or not being Christian at all. Other than the tendency to elevate charismatic gifts, the Montanists taught no serious divergent doctrines and were generally considered orthodox. One of the great scholars of the early apostolic fathers was Tertullian, and Tertullian was a Montanist. What kind of reaction did the church have to persecution and heresy? Well, continual persecution and growing trends toward false doctrine created problems for the early church, as you might well expect. How can church leaders protect congregations and guarantee fidelity to apostolic teaching? How can churches keep believers from falling prey to false teachers or giving in to the demands they deny their faith? Should Christians who sin by accommodating to Rome be allowed back into the fellowship? Should those who followed heretics for a time and then who came back be allowed to re-enter the church? Well, John Maxwell, who's a church consultant today, says everything rises or falls on leadership. Ineffective leadership produces unhealthy, unproductive churches. Good leaders create healthy churches. So in the first century, church leadership was essential. And church leadership functions fell into two categories in the earliest Christian church. There were general leaders and local leaders. By the end of the first century, general leaders, the apostles, prophets, and teachers, were no longer part of the church scene. Elders, plural, guided the church, but leadership by committee doesn't work well when there's pressure. When under pressure, a point man can generally act more quickly on behalf of the entire church's leadership. So to promote unity and facilitate decision-making, elders elevated one man and designated him as bishop. The bishop served as president of the congregation, a term seen in the writings of Justin Martyr. He served as chairman of the elders, or in some cases, as what we might call today, the pastor. Historians refer to this decision to elevate one man as the origin of the monarchical bishop, the one man bishop, and marks a significant change in church leadership. Elders, or presbyters, remained in place as an advisory council to the bishop, but clearly the bishop is now the individual who is leading the church. The bishop is now the individual who makes decisions about what to do when persecution comes. The bishop is the one who determines whether a teaching is true or false. The bishop is the one who is responsible for maintaining the church's purity. Around the beginning of the 2nd century, there were letters written by a man named Ignatius of Antioch, and these support my understanding of this change. Arrested for his faith, Ignatius was taken to Rome for trial. On the way, he wrote 7 letters in which he named several congregations with monarchical bishops. Polycarp, who was later martyred for his faith, served as the bishop of Smyrna. Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch, a congregation Paul once served following his conversion. Ignatius's letters reveal 2 concerns: heresy-related dissension and problems arising due to persecution. Ignatius argues in his letters that churches should recognize the bishop as the source of genuine biblical teaching as well as the focus of congregational unity. The monarchical bishop responds quickly to perceived threats, thus protecting congregations from doctrinal error or leading them to resist persecution. Ignatius does not suggest this change to every church, but he reaffirms or affirms the practice where it already exists. That Ignatius would argue this practice is an interesting problem for historians. If we understand that an elder or bishop was an older man, this raises a question. Ignatius writes his letters about AD 107. Paul died in Rome in AD 64. Paul served as a leader in Antioch until his first missionary journey sometime around AD 46 to 48. So it is not inconceivable that Ignatius was a young lad in Antioch at that time. If he were, let's say, 10 years old, that would make him aware of Paul and his teaching. If Ignatius were 10 when Paul began his missionary journeys, he would be about 61 years old at the time he writes the letters. The question then arises, how could a young man steeped in Paul's teaching and from a church where Paul taught so long be so cavalier about suggesting one-man rule in the church? After all, Paul had counseled that elders be appointed in the church. He told Timothy and Titus to ordain elders, plural, in every church. What would lead, then, a man like Ignatius to elevate one man and make him more important than the others, especially since he had a background in Pauline teaching? No one has a good answer to the problem. Appointing a bishop to lead local congregations quickly became trendy. Not all churches followed suit, but the practice became common. I think it's significant that the church in Rome did not elevate a monarchical bishop until at least AD 135, and that in turn raises questions about Roman Catholic claims concerning the primacy of Peter or even apostolic succession. It wasn't long until bishops in larger congregations or the empire's major cities became influential. These bishops became known as metropolitan bishops. They were located in large cities. And as a result, they were simply referred to as metropolitan bishops. The 5 major centers that became extremely influential were found in Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch. From these beginnings, it was a short step for bishops to garner greater authority, particularly in the large cities. Congregations established satellite churches for the convenience of Christians who found it difficult to attend the central church's meeting place. By this time, only bishops baptized new converts or blessed the emblems of the Lord's Supper. Therefore, bishops would bless the elements and send them to a satellite assembly with an elder. The elder administered the Lord's Supper and arranged for baptisms when needed. It was not long before an elder became identified with a satellite church and was acknowledged as priest. Although it sounds far-fetched, the origin of the term priest actually comes from the word presbyter. With these changes, the stage is set for the ecclesiastical development of the church. Metropolitan bishops continue their influence in the Eastern Orthodox Church, although Roman Catholics and others loosely apply the title Pope to Roman bishops. It was not until Gregory the Great, around AD 600, that there was sufficient power invested in the Bishop of Rome that he could be considered Pope. And even then, Gregory the Great did not use the title. In the next letter, we'll begin to look at the different things that bring about the Christianizing of the entire Roman Empire. We'll look at Constantine and how he came to power, and we'll consider what happened as a result of his coming to the imperial throne.